Do you want us to pose a certain way?
Facing the camera is always a popular choice.
I sense trouble.
This is Julia Roberts.
Oh, wow. I'm such a big fan of yours.
Do you remember those 90s sitcoms, the ones that kept going long after the magic was gone? In living rooms across America, these shows started as must-watch TV before turning into background noise we could not quite turn off. What made them stay so long, and why did we keep watching? You can almost hear it, the clatter of suspenders, the whine of "Did I do that?" echoing through a living room somewhere in the mid-90s. Family Matters started as a family comedy with a big heart, and then something shifted. It was supposed to be about the Winslows. Working-class Chicago, 3 generations under one roof, laugh-track warmth and soft moral lessons at the end of every episode. But then came Steve Urkel, and the show never quite found its balance again. Urkel was a breakout character, no question. He was weird, he was brilliant, he was oddly lovable. He walked into the show as a one-time guest star, and by season 2, he owned the living room. Producers rewrote the entire series around him, sidelining storylines that used to be about parenting, marriage, and growing up Black in America. Urkel got gadgets, Urkel got alter egos, Urkel got a cape, a rocket, and an entire multi-episode arc about being cool. The Winslows became supporting characters in their own house, and slowly, the heart of the show, the family, faded into the background. By the time Urkel turned into a Bruce Wayne clone and dated 2 women at once, the original vision was long gone. Family Matters had become a cartoon with real people in it, and no amount of sweet endings could bring it back to earth. Still, the show clung to the airwaves for 9 seasons. 9. That is a long time to keep recycling a catchphrase and hoping no one notices. And by the end, most of the original charm had worn off. Fans stuck around out of loyalty, not laughter. Because Family Matters did matter. For a while. It gave us Carl's speeches, Laura's confidence, and Eddie's earnest mess-ups. But in trying to stay alive, it forgot what made it special in the first place. When the show ended in 1998, it was not with a bang. It just kind of drifted away. No big finale, no goodbye. Just the final gasp of a series that had once felt fresh but stayed far too long at the dinner table. And even today, you cannot help but ask, did Family Matters go on long enough to undo everything that made it beloved? There was a time when every grunt from Tim Allen could send an audience into stitches. Home Improvement was a giant, massive ratings, top-tier cast, and that strange combination of sitcom simplicity and hardware store testosterone. But like all long-running sitcoms, there comes a moment when the paint starts to chip, and for Home Improvement, that moment dragged across multiple seasons. In the beginning, it worked. Tim, the tool man. Taylor broke things. Al Borland fixed them. Jill rolled her eyes. The kids got into relatable suburban mischief. And Wilson, mysterious, wise, and forever hidden by a fence, offered life lessons that actually landed. It was a formula, but it worked. Until it didn't. The signs were slow. A kid actor hitting puberty too fast, storylines running in circles. Tim's more power jokes started feeling like reruns before the episode even ended. Jill's character development was stuck in a cycle of tolerance and frustration. Mark turned goth. Randy turned invisible. Brad was mostly just still there. The family dynamic was frozen, even as the kids clearly outgrew it. Behind the scenes, things were cracking too. Actors wanted out. Writers ran low on new ideas. And all the while, the show tried to patch the gaps with cameos and celebrity stunts. The result? More noise, less heart. Home Improvement ended in 1999, just shy of a decade on air. It got a send-off. A farewell, but not a peak. And while it is remembered fondly by many, the truth is this. It should have wrapped 2 seasons earlier. It is hard to say goodbye when the ratings are still decent. Harder still when syndication money is calling. But sometimes the bravest thing a show can do is stop. Home Improvement taught us that more power is not always the answer, and sometimes the best fix is knowing when to put the tools down. You remember the blue sofa, the everyday mishaps, and the laugh track that felt like a friend nudging you. The Drew Carey Show arrived in the mid-90s and felt like nothing else on television. A working-class sitcom that did not apologize for being ordinary. It started honest, with Drew teaching special education, hanging out at Winfred Louder, and surviving life in Cleveland with his oddball friends. It was sharp, relatable, and lived in the sweet spot between sincere and silly. But somewhere around season 5, it began staying around not because it had something to say, but because it could. Early seasons gave us Drew bottoming out romantically, living paycheck to paycheck, and trying to sort out adulthood without a script. It was funny because it was familiar, but then came the detours. Broadway musicals in the middle of Winfred Louder, episode-watching commercials, the show within the show, weird animations, reality show spoofs. The writers got creative, too creative. They shifted from grounded situational jokes to spectacle-driven gimmicks. It was entertaining at first. The cast would break into song and dance routines that felt more like fever dreams than punchlines. At one point, Drew fought himself in a game show simulation while an announcer shouted stage directions. Craig Ferguson showed up with an accent and energy that pushed the tone even further into cartoon territory. Episodes began to look like improv sketches in search of a premise. There was even an April Fool's episode where nothing made sense, and that was the whole joke. Fans laughed, but also blinked. Was this still a sitcom or an experimental variety show? The realism was gone, but the show just kept pushing forward. It was like watching your favorite local diner suddenly try to become Cirque du Soleil. You went because you remembered how good the burgers used to be, not because you still liked the menu. Suddenly, there were episodes where the whole cast was trapped in a vent shaft. Other times, the entire business was a theme park. Drew Carey himself got involved in less life as a guy in Cleveland and more, I want ratings, so let us do an audience stunt. The show turned into an experiment lab of silliness. First it was bold, then it was tiring, then it felt desperate. Some episodes were praised. Others were questions like, is this still the Drew Carey Show or something else? Cast dynamics began to suffer. Ryan Stiles and Colin Mockery left one after another, shifting away from the improv troupe, feeling that made the show unique. Catherine Joosten never quite bought back the suburban mom atmosphere that premiere seasons had, and Carey himself joked that the writing staff was wearing out. Because they were. Writing 30-plus episodes a season is a grind. 9 seasons in, the charm had been ground down. What remained were jokes, some funny, most familiar, delivered in structures that were no longer fresh. Executives pushed for revivals within the show. They wanted skits, guest stars, chart appearances. The original premise got buried under press pieces and search for hit episodes. Viewers stuck around out of loyalty because some episodes were still funny, because Cleveland felt lived in, but they were also aware this show was past its expiry date. And by the time it wrapped in 2004, it felt like the cast was ready to walk away. And so were most of us. The Drew Carey Show left a legacy. It brought improv comedy into mainstream prime time. It gave Drew Carey a platform and a place in pop culture history. But it also traded coherence for stunts. And that is how it became a case study in growing pains. There is power in telling a story about people that feel real. There is risk in rambling on after the story has been told. The show went on 9 seasons, but the question lingers. Did it end because it had to, or because it should? You probably did not wear matching sweaters, but for a decade, Full House felt like it. It was sweet, sappy, and unapologetically family-oriented. For 8 seasons, thousands of episodes, it offered the same formula. A widow, 3 daughters, 2 uncles, a best friend, and a house with way too many hearts in it. It was comfort food television. It gave us Danny, Jesse, Joey, Michelle, teachings about manners, sharing, honesty. But by the time it entered its 8th season in 1994, that formula had worn a groove, and audiences began to wonder, are we still learning lessons or stuck in them? In the earlier years, the show had charm. The family dynamics felt fun and vibrant. DJ dealt with dating. Stephanie argued with Michelle. Jesse tried to relaunch his music career. It felt like real people balancing love and responsibility. That matters. And for many viewers, it felt like coming home. But by season 6, even the youngest cast members were growing faster than the writing could evolve. Storylines began revolving around Michelle's cuteness because it was the only guaranteed laugh left. Joey's cartoon voices became more frequent, but somehow less funny. Stephanie, once sharp and mischievous, became mostly reaction shots. Danny Tanner's obsessive cleaning felt like the only running gag the writers could still rely on. Even the emotional moments started to feel scheduled, like a calendar reminder to cue sad music. The show's warmth never fully disappeared, but it started to feel manufactured. There were still smiles, but fewer surprises, and in a show built on heart that made the heart feel hollow. As the 90s wore on, plot lines recycled. Remember Michelle's imaginary friend? Stephanie learning to drive? DJ's prom? They did those again. Everyone got married or pregnant off-screen. Aunt Becky's personality switched between seasons. Cousin Estelle appeared, seemingly just to remind us of season 1. The writers leaned hard on nostalgia, plugging in one more toy or catchphrase hoping it would land. By season 7, they were running out of material, but still delivering 30 episodes a year. The sad thing is, the audience saw it. Ratings held steady, not plummeting but not growing either, and eventually ABC pulled the plug. The ending in 1995 was soft. More hugs, more speeches, more promises that the Tanner family would be fine. But the glow had faded. Full House felt like a decade of sitcom comfort eroded by exhaustion and repetition. Yet there is something immortal about Full House. Children grew up with it. Catchphrases stuck, memes happened, and then years later, there was that reboot. Because the nostalgia was real. But let us not forget, the original ran 8 seasons, longer than it should have. And by the final episodes, it carried more echoes of itself than fresh voice. When you watch primetime television aiming for comfort, you cross a line into cliché. And that is exactly where Full House stood by the end. Today, we remember the tight hugs, the moral lessons, and the girl that said, "How rude." We remember the handshakes, the matching pajamas, the laugh that came before the music swelled, but we also remember the stagnant plots, the repeated situations, the way it felt like a great comfort system kept running on fumes. Some shows are worth revisiting a year later. Full House? Maybe worth visiting the first 5 seasons. Because comfort has a shelf life. Boy Meets World should have ended with the diploma. Corey, Topanga, Sean, Eric, they had grown up, graduated, and said their goodbyes. It was sweet, it was honest, it was enough. But the show kept going, wandering into college, then adulthood, and then into a version of itself that felt like someone had copied the homework but left out the heart. Boy Meets World was a coming-of-age story that refused to stop coming. It started strong. A 6th grader with a best friend, a cool teacher, and a crush on the girl who sat behind him. Corey Matthews was not special, and that was the point. He was messy, emotional, goofy, awkward, all the things real kids are. And as he grew, the show did too. We watched him deal with loss, confusion, identity, and first love, and we felt it all because it was grounded in something true. Then the episodes shifted. They were older, but somehow less real. Suddenly, everyone was over the top. Eric became a caricature. Corey lost his everyman charm and got stuck in cycles of jealousy and weird decision-making. The stories became louder, faster, stranger. Remember when Corey glued his face to a bench? When Eric adopted a squirrel and renamed himself Plays with Squirrels? The heart was still there, but buried under noise. It was the kind of show that taught you something without preaching. It gave you awkward first kisses, cafeteria heartbreak, and real talks in the middle of the night. But by the end, it felt like it was trying to squeeze out one more message after the bell had already rung. Characters stopped growing and started looping. You could almost predict the arc: problem, misunderstanding, speech, resolution. Even Mr. Feeney, once the moral compass of the show, was reduced to background support. The emotion was still there, but it felt recycled. Episodes that once left you thinking now left you shrugging. You were not watching to learn anymore. You were watching because you remembered how it used to feel. And maybe that is the truest sign a show has gone on too long, when memory becomes the main reason to stay. Topanga, once a feminist with fire and weirdness, was slowly reduced to the girlfriend, and eventually, the wife. Sean's inner turmoil was still written well, but the show kept finding ways to solve things too easily. College became just another hallway. Adult life looked a lot like the same sitcom set with new wallpaper. The writing could still surprise you, but fewer and fewer episodes actually did. You can feel it when a show is stalling. Plots repeat. Side characters get more airtime. Wedding episodes start stacking up. Boy Meets World lasted 7 seasons, but it did not need that many. Seasons 6 and 7 especially began to drift, not because the cast failed, but because the concept had already wrapped itself up. And yet we kept watching. Because we loved these characters. Because Mr. Feeney still made us cry. Because even when it was losing its shape, the show had enough memory of what it once was to keep us hanging on. But by the end, it felt like a lesson that had already been learned. A good story told one too many times. Years later, the reboot Girl Meets World brought things full circle. And while it had its own tone, it reminded people of what Boy Meets World meant at its best. Not the late seasons, not the stunts, but the quiet, true moments. Carey and Sean talking on a curb. Feeney whispering, "Do good." The end was beautiful, but it came 2 seasons too late. Boy Meets World deserved to go out with a soft smile and a strong message. Instead, it limped across the finish line with a speech and a curtain call. And even then, we still clapped. Because sometimes, love keeps you watching even after the credits should have rolled. Step by Step began with a Brady Bunch blueprint and a whole lot of denim. 2 single parents, each with 3 kids, get married and try to blend into one big, loud, chaotic family. It had the makings of a perfect 90s sitcom. Beach house vibes, a roller coaster in the opening credits, and Suzanne Summers with her game face on. For the first few seasons, it worked. The characters clashed, bonded, and stumbled through the growing pains of new family dynamics. But Step by Step did not know when to step away. The show always had a strange relationship with balance. One episode would lean into family drama. The next would feel like a cartoon. Sometimes Dana was delivering biting feminist monologues, and other times she was doing wacky physical comedy with a rubber chicken. Cody, the fan-favorite van dweller, would steal entire episodes and then disappear for half a season without explanation. Brendan, the youngest son, was quietly written out of the show with zero acknowledgement, like a glitch in the sitcom matrix. New kids were born and aged rapidly, with personality changes to match. It got to a point where tracking the timeline of Step by Step felt like solving a sitcom-themed logic puzzle. And through it all, Frank and Carol just kept smiling like nothing was weird. Step by Step was part of the legendary TGIF lineup, and for a while, that gave it life. But even as other shows found new rhythms, Step by Step stayed stuck. By the late 90s, the plots were repeating, the jokes got safer, and every moral wrapped up with a hug or a speech about responsibility. Carol ran a salon, then did not. Frank built houses, and then kind of stopped. The kids never really left the house. They just rotated bedrooms. The show had charm, sure, but the longer it ran, the more you could see the seams. Brandon Call, who played JT, looked like he had outgrown the role. Dana, once the feminist firebrand, became a one-note nag. Mark got cooler. Al disappeared. Lily went from baby to kindergartner in a blink. It was a sitcom trying to age but afraid to grow. Eventually, ABC canceled the show after season 6, but CBS picked it up for a final year. And that last season? It felt like a show that already knew it was done. Ratings dipped. Fan interest faded. Even the writers seemed unsure what to do next. By the finale, there was no real goodbye, no big wedding, no flashbacks, just a regular episode. Because Step by Step did not plan for an ending. It just kept going until it could not anymore. Looking back, there is still warmth in those early seasons. Still something honest about watching a family try to become one. But like a ride that lasted one too many turns, it left you queasy, not nostalgic. Step by Step had a place in 90s sitcom history. It just stayed on the stage after the spotlight dimmed. Grace Under Fire started with Bite, a blue-collar, working-class mom trying to rebuild her life after an abusive marriage. That was not a typical sitcom premise in 1993. But Brett Butler brought grit and timing and that unmistakable Southern drawl that made Grace Kelly feel like a real person. She was sharp, tired, funny, and fed up. The show had edge. It had empathy. And it felt different in a TV landscape filled with cozy apartments and laugh-track parenting. But Grace Under Fire also became a textbook case of a show that burned out before it bowed out. The early seasons hit hard. Grace was raising 3 kids, working in a chemical plant, and navigating sobriety. It was messy and honest. The show tackled addiction, single motherhood, and workplace sexism, without ever turning the issues into very special episodes. It felt like sitcoms had finally grown up a little, and Grace was leading the charge. Her friendships at work were the emotional glue, real conversations over factory noise, not coffee shop banter. And when the show was funny, it was genuinely funny, dry, biting, and unafraid. It never asked you to pity Grace just to understand her. But then things changed. Behind the scenes, Brett Butler was struggling. The pressure of fame, personal battles with addiction, clashes with producers, it all started spilling into the show. Cast members left, writers cycled out, and slowly, the series started to lose its voice. Storylines turned erratic. The comedy got broader, the characters flatter. Grace began dating weirder men, making stranger decisions, and the family dynamic that once grounded the show started to fray. The 5th and final season was barely holding together. New characters were introduced like patchwork. Grace got a new job. Her kids grew up or vanished into the background. The tone swung from grounded dramedy to surreal sitcom noise. Episodes felt unfinished, like first drafts no one had time to rewrite. Grace went from layered to loud, and not in a good way. And when the laughs stopped landing, so did the ratings. ABC eventually pulled the plug, citing declining ratings and increasing chaos behind the scenes. But fans knew the truth. Grace Under Fire had already ended seasons earlier. It just kept airing. Looking back, it is a show with 2 legacies. On one side, a bold, groundbreaking sitcom led by a woman who refused to play nice. On the other, a cautionary tale about what happens when talent collides with turmoil. Brett Butler made that role unforgettable, but even she could not carry it through the collapse. Grace Kelly was a fighter, but sometimes even the strongest characters get written into corners they cannot escape. Mad About You was always a little quieter than the rest. It did not have slapstick. It did not have zany neighbors. It had Paul and Jamie Buckman, 2 neurotic New Yorkers navigating marriage, work, and a dog named Murray. It was adult. It was intimate. It was built on banter and timing and the kind of chemistry you cannot fake. For the first few seasons, it felt like eavesdropping on a real relationship, and that made it special. Helen Hunt and Paul Reiser were magic together. They argued, they overanalyzed, they whispered their punchlines like they were secrets, and it worked. The show made its mark not by shouting, but by leaning in. Even the silences had weight. A glance across the room could deliver more than a monologue. It was romantic without being sappy, smart without being smug. But even great rhythms can lose their beat. As the seasons piled up, the stories started stretching. The intimacy turned into repetition. Jamie's quirks became grating. Paul's neuroticism got louder. The show tried to keep it grounded, but the spark dimmed. And then they had a baby. Mabel Buchman was born in season 6, and that changed everything. Suddenly, the show was not about a couple, it was about parenting. The banter gave way to diapers and sleep training. And while some episodes still landed, the tone shifted from fresh to familiar. The writers knew it too. That is why they fast-forwarded the final season into the future, to show us what happened next. It was bold, but it felt like a show trying to outpace its own fatigue. The flash-forward finale had heartbreak and humor. It tried to tie everything up, but it also revealed something uncomfortable, that maybe we should not have seen this far, that maybe some stories work best when they leave a little mystery. Jamie and Paul divorced, then remarried, then cried, then danced. It was a lot. It was everything and nothing, wrapped in a bow of unresolved emotions. Some fans loved the risk. Others just wanted their quiet couple back. By the end, Mad About You had become the kind of show people respected more than loved. It won Emmys. It had incredible guest stars. But the last seasons felt like the kind of marriage you stay in out of habit, not heat. Comfortable but no longer compelling. They tried a revival in 2019, bringing Paul and Jamie back as empty nesters. But the magic did not return. Nostalgia was not enough. Mad About You started with love and ended with distance, and maybe that is the most honest thing it ever did. Murphy Brown was never just another sitcom. It was a statement. When it debuted in 1988, it felt like lightning in a bottle, smart, sharp, topical. Candice Bergen played the title role like she had been waiting her whole life to unleash this character on the world. Murphy was a hard-nosed journalist with a sharp wit, a sharper tongue, and zero interest in playing nice, and audiences loved her for it. The show tackled politics, gender roles, and media spin at a time when most sitcoms were still stuck in laugh-track suburbia. It won Emmys. It won headlines. It even won the ire of a sitting vice president. That infamous spat with Dan Quayle over Murphy's single motherhood storyline made the show feel urgent in a way few comedies ever had. You did not just watch Murphy Brown, you debated it. And for most of its early run, it worked. The cast clicked. The writing was fast and fearless. Bergen's Murphy was flanked by a solid supporting team: Frank, Corky, Jim, Miles, each one distinct, each one adding texture to the newsroom chaos. They were funny, flawed, and full of heart, but most importantly, they felt like real people. Then the years passed, and the edges started to dull. Storylines shifted from sharp satire to awkward self-awareness. Characters began to drift. Corky's naivete became overplayed. Frank's neurosis became noise. Even Murphy herself seemed stuck in loops, always yelling but rarely evolving. The social commentary started to feel out of date rather than ahead of its time. Guest stars came and went, often more distracting than fresh. The newsroom, once a lively symbol of truth-telling, started to feel like a tired backdrop. And the show's final season tried to go big, but landed small. By the final season in 1998, things felt tired. Even the big finale, Murphy's cancer storyline and spiritual soul-searching, landed more like a slow exhale than a triumphant send-off. Viewers respected it, but they were also ready to say goodbye. What made Murphy Brown special in its early years, its boldness, its relevance, its refusal to play it safe, slowly became the very thing it could not keep up with. It tried to be current, but often felt out of sync with a changing world. What had once been groundbreaking became oddly safe. Even the jokes lost their bite. The chemistry was still there, but the fire was not. It was like watching a band play their hits on autopilot. Nostalgic, but not alive. The 2018 reboot proved the same point. It was clever, but the moment had passed. Murphy Brown had a solid legacy, but it should have ended a season or two earlier, when the wit still stung and the newsroom still mattered. Instead, it faded out like so many other shows, respected but not missed. Coach was a feel-good sitcom built around football, fatherhood, and just enough grumpiness to keep things interesting. It started in 1989 and starred Craig T. Nelson as Hayden Fox, the head coach of a fictional college football team in Minnesota. He was loud, he was stubborn, he was not always right, but he was always trying. And for a while, that was enough. The early seasons of Coach worked because they kept things simple. Football was the backdrop, but the show was really about relationships. Hayden and his daughter Kelly. Hayden and assistant coach Luther, played brilliantly by Jerry Van Dyke. Hayden and Dauber, the lovable oaf with a heart of gold. The comedy was broad but clean. The rhythms were familiar. It was comfort food television at its best. It was also a rare sitcom where the characters felt like people you could actually know. They bickered, but it never felt mean. They made mistakes, but it was never cruel. And through all of it, Hayden grew, not dramatically, but just enough. He softened over time, without losing his edge. That is harder to pull off than it looks. The show found its sweet spot and stayed there for a while. But then, like so many shows, it kept going. By the mid-1990s, Coach had moved its characters out of Minnesota and into the professional leagues. Hayden was now coaching a fictional NFL expansion team, and the show struggled to keep that original charm. The smaller stakes were gone. The father-daughter dynamic faded. And while Dauber and Luther remained hilarious, their bits started feeling repetitive. Even Christine, Hayden's long-suffering partner, later wife, became more of a plot device than a character. Gone were the grounded relationship arcs. In their place were sitcom misunderstandings and drawn-out wedding storylines. The warmth started leaking out. The timing got looser. Episodes began to blur together, not because the show was bad, but because it had nothing new to say. The heart of the show, the grounded emotion behind the comedy, got traded in for more cartoonish setups. The football stuff was bigger, but the laughs were smaller. And Hayden? He became less endearing curmudgeon and more irritable sitcom cliché. It was a subtle shift at first. One too many episodes about NFL politics. One too few about Kelly or the bond between Hayden and Luther. And eventually, the show forgot what had made it so watchable in the first place. It became about plot instead of people, about staying on the air instead of sticking the landing. Viewers could feel it. The show was coasting. The shift to the NFL setting was a gamble, and it never really paid off. What once felt personal started feeling corporate. The team may have had a new stadium, but the soul of the show stayed back in Minnesota. Jokes got louder, plots got thinner. You could see it in the pacing. Jokes that used to land with a wink now came with a nudge. Guest stars popped in for stunt casting. Longtime characters like Howard Burley got sidelined. The balance was gone. The magic was flickering. And Coach, like so many long-running sitcoms, started repeating itself. Luther's antics were still funny, but even those started to feel forced. Dauber was still sweet, but mostly there to remind you of better seasons. And the chemistry between Hayden and Christine, Shelley Fabares, grew stale. Coach finally ended in 1997 after 9 seasons and over 200 episodes. It was a respectable run, but few would argue it needed to last that long. Most fans agree the show peaked in the middle and stayed on the field too long after the final whistle blew. It was not a crash. It was not a scandal. It was just fatigue, the kind that sets in when a show does not know how to say goodbye. And while the finale gave fans closure, a new job, new beginnings, it lacked the emotional punch of the early years. The humor, the heart, the huddle, it was all still there, just running on fumes. In the end, Coach was a classic case of a sitcom that had the ball, ran it well, but forgot to head to the locker room when it mattered most. There is something timeless about two opposites living under one roof, one loud, one reserved, one naive and enthusiastic, the other cynical and exhausted. That is the entire premise of Perfect Strangers, and for a while, it was a sitcom goldmine. You had Balky Bartokomous, an endlessly cheerful immigrant from the fictional island of Mypos, moved to Chicago and lived with his distant American cousin, Larry Appleton. And from the second Balky said, "Don't be ridiculous." The audience was hooked. It worked because of the chemistry. Mark Lynn-Baker and Bronson Pinchot had something real between them, something oddly vulnerable, especially in the earlier seasons. Larry, ever the neurotic middle-class striver, was constantly on edge. Balky, wide-eyed and generous, made him look at the world differently. And that friction between culture, personality, and priorities was what gave the show its warmth. It was not just slapstick, it was about empathy, or at least it started that way. As the seasons piled on, though, things shifted. What began as a grounded culture clash sitcom turned into a slapstick circus. By the middle seasons, every episode seemed to end in a farce. Balky and Larry getting stuck in a department store overnight. Balky and Larry accidentally destroying a wedding cake. Balky and Larry trying to raise a sheep in their apartment. The emotional realism that made their friendship special got drowned in pratfalls and misunderstandings. And do not get me wrong, Bronson Pinchot was funny. He had a wild physicality, a sharp comedic rhythm, and a character that could carry a whole scene with just a facial expression. But eventually, it felt like the writers leaned too hard into that. Balky stopped being a character and started becoming a punchline machine. Larry, meanwhile, spent more and more time yelling. The balance that made them work? It slowly fell apart. Part of the issue was that the characters stopped growing. After several seasons of learning, arguing, bonding, and laughing, you would think the dynamic might evolve a little. But it did not. They were still having the same fights. Still misunderstanding each other the exact same way. Still making the same mistakes. And audiences noticed. To try and shake things up, the show did what so many long-running sitcoms do. It aged up the situation. Balky and Larry both got married. They moved into a house. They got jobs. They had kids. The classic sitcom domestic reboot. But by then, the tone had already calcified. The stories were flatter. The charm was recycled. Even the show's final season felt like a quiet afterthought. Episodes shuffled around, not always aired in order, as if the network knew it had already lost momentum. Perfect Strangers was never supposed to last forever. And maybe that is part of why people still look back on it fondly. It had heart, and it gave us some unforgettable moments. But it went past its sweet spot. It kept telling the same story long after the story had already been told. And when a show becomes its own echo, you stop laughing with it and start watching out of habit. There is a very specific kind of sitcom that only existed in the 1970s. The kind where a group of overgrown kids, usually men, do not really have jobs, goals, or common sense, but they have each other. The San Pedro Beach Bums was that show. 5 guys, 1 boat, 0 direction, and somehow that was the charm. The setup was as thin as the plot lines. A bunch of young men, none particularly responsible, lived together on a houseboat in San Pedro, California. That was it. No high concept, no real stakes. Just pure, unfiltered 1970s mischief, usually with someone falling overboard or getting caught in a lie before the commercial break. The cast was a mix of personalities: the pretty one, the dumb one, the sensible one, the awkward one, and the enthusiastic one. You have seen that lineup before, and you will see it again. But the Beach Bums had something odd going for them. They actually seemed like friends. It was not just actors reading lines. It felt like 5 guys who had been stuck together long enough to actually care about one another, in the way only sitcom friends can. It was slapstick heavy, no doubt. People slipped on wet docks. Furniture got broken. There was always some hijink involving girls, jobs, or trying to scam their way out of rent. But it never felt mean. It was chaotic, but soft. You got the sense that nobody in this show would ever really get hurt or stay mad for more than 5 minutes. What made the San Pedro Beach Bums stand out, weirdly, was how low the ambition was. This was not a sitcom trying to say anything profound. It did not chase ratings by tackling hot-button issues. It was just 5 lovable dorks trying to live rent-free on a floating living room. And in an era of shows that were getting bigger, louder, and more political, there was something oddly refreshing about that. It was also very much a product of its time. The fashion, the slang, the music, all of it screams late 1970s California in a way that almost feels like parody today. But back then, it was just what life looked like if you were young, broke, and in no hurry to grow up. The show was created by William Blinn, who also worked on Starsky and Hutch, but you would never guess it from the tone. Where Starsky had grit, Beach Bums had flip-flops and water fights. And it was that shift, from high drama to low-stakes comedy, that made it both forgettable and kind of perfect. It aired just 10 episodes before being pulled off the schedule. Critics barely had time to write it up. Audiences did not have much time to fall in love with it. But the ones who did? They remember the lazy charm, the sun-soaked boat, and the friendships that felt just real enough. It was not groundbreaking, it was not polished, but the San Pedro Beach Bums was weird, warm, and somehow unforgettable. And if you ever caught it during its short run, you probably smiled more than you expected to. It's a Living was a very different kind of weird. Less aliens and secret agents, more glitter, sass, and waitresses in a restaurant that rotated. Literally. The show was set at a high-end restaurant on top of a fancy hotel in Los Angeles, and the whole thing slowly spun in a circle while the characters dished out food and punchlines. You might think, okay, that is not that weird, but remember, this was a sitcom about servers trying to hold their lives together while walking on carpet that was always in motion. It was like Cheers, but with more sequins and a way bigger risk of dropping soup. The show followed a group of waitresses, each with their own dreams, drama, and ridiculous uniform. We are talking puffy sleeves, giant hair, heels at work, the whole glamorous disaster. And yet, despite the glitz, the characters were down to earth. They were just trying to pay rent, chase dreams, and survive a job that was one weird table away from breaking them. Some wanted to be actresses, some wanted stability, and some just wanted to survive another double shift without quitting. It was all sparkle and exhaustion, like a glitter bomb exploded in a time clock. Behind every smile was a character one broken plate away from quitting on the spot. The comedy was sharp, way sharper than most people expected. These women were constantly roasting each other, the customers, and especially the manager, a piano-playing wisecracker who doubled as the lounge act. The whole show lived in this strange space between over-the-top glamour and day-to-day struggle. You had dramatic breakups and goofy food fights in the same scene. The emotional whiplash was real, but it somehow worked, probably because the cast had chemistry you could feel through the screen. And the setting? It was like a time capsule of 80s excess. The carpet was deep red. The lighting was soft gold. The windows showed fake cityscapes. It felt like every hotel restaurant your parents were too scared to take you to. You could almost smell the overpriced lobster and cheap champagne through the screen. But that was the magic. This weird, spinning restaurant felt like its own world. A glittery bubble of drama, jokes, and just enough heart to keep you watching. It also stood out because it showed working women with humor and grit. They were flawed, funny, ambitious, and completely over it. One minute they were giving love advice. The next, they were dodging weird customers and trying to get their shifts covered. And behind all the jokes, there was always a little bit of truth about friendship, burnout, and what it means to get through life one table at a time. For kids watching in the 1980s, maybe it was not the first show that came to mind, but if you caught it, you remembered it. Mostly because it felt like a grown-up world that somehow welcomed you in anyway. It's a Living said, yeah, life is hard, but if you have good friends, strong heels, and enough one-liners, you will be just fine. And honestly, that is not a bad lesson to pick up during prime time. Salute Your Shorts was summer chaos in a canteen, and it never pretended to be anything else. It was loud, it was messy, it was full of farts, fights, pranks, and perfectly awkward teenage energy. Camp Anawana was not a place where you became a better person. It was where you survived the weirdest summer of your life, and maybe came out a little stronger for it. This show was Nickelodeon in its rawest form. Zero polish, all heart. Every episode felt like it had been made in the dirt, in the heat, under the screech of a bug zapper, and that was the point. The kids were not actors. They were walking disasters with just enough charm to keep you watching. You had the bully, the nerd, the weirdo, the jock, but it never felt fake. They were too wild to be scripted, too alive to be boring. You watched because it felt real. Not real like documentary, real like, I remember what it was like to be 13 and not know what the hell was going on. There were food fights, broken bunk beds, stolen underwear on flagpoles, and in the middle of all that, tiny moments of heart. Someone standing up for the little guy. Someone realizing they actually missed home. Someone writing a dumb song that accidentally made everyone cry. Salute Your Shorts was a love letter to the summer you swore you hated but secretly treasure to this day. It was uncomfortable. It was inappropriate. It was exactly what being a kid felt like. Jeff Cohen gave us one of the most unforgettable performances in 80s cinema. And he did it with a belly, a scream, and a dance. As Chunk in the Goonies, he was the heart of a generation's favorite misfit crew. He was not cool, not slick, not heroic in the classic sense, but he was real, and that made him unforgettable. The Truffle Shuffle became legend, and so did Jeff. But then, nothing. After the Goonies, Jeff Cohen quietly left the screen behind. No chase for bigger roles, no desperate clinging to fame. Instead, he did something few expected. He reinvented himself. While Hollywood was busy trying to fit him into boxes he had already outgrown, Jeff walked away and studied law. He became an entertainment lawyer, not a punchline, not a sidekick, a force. Today, he is behind the scenes, navigating contracts instead of scripts, protecting artists instead of performing as one. And the irony is beautiful. The kid who once had to shout to be heard now helps others speak for themselves. He is powerful, respected, and deeply grounded in the very industry that once tried to define him. His story is not just about transformation. It is about reclaiming identity, about proving that child actors are not frozen in time. They grow, they evolve, and sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is trade the spotlight for something quieter, but just as impactful. Jeff Cohen did not just disappear. He became something more. The Ben Stiller Show was where sarcasm met sincerity, sketch met structure, and comedy took a slightly weirder turn. It aired in various forms from 1992 to 1995, first on MTV and later on Fox, but barely lasted a season in either place. Still, for those who caught it, it felt like something new. Ben Stiller, then just beginning his rise, hosted and led the sketches, joined by future legends like Janine Garofalo, Andy Dick, and Bob Odenkirk. The writing was sharp, offbeat, and unafraid to punch both up and sideways. It parodied pop culture with a precision that felt less like ridicule and more like dissection. But it was too niche, too weird, too smart for a mass audience that was still tuned into sitcom comfort food. There was a sketch where Ben played Tom Cruise in a fake action movie trailer, and it felt more accurate than the real thing. The humor was meta before meta was a buzzword. You weren't just laughing, you were being let in on a creative secret. Ratings never clicked. Fox pulled the plug, but the echoes of its style, fast edits, character-driven absurdity, and deep-cut satire are all over modern comedy. In many ways, it was a blueprint, a test run for what would become the tone of shows like Mr. Show, The Office, or even sketch segments on late night. The Ben Stiller Show proved that comedy could be thoughtful without being preachy, and even though it was gone in a flash, it left behind a creative footprint that never really faded. There was a time when Kate and Allie felt like the future of sitcoms. Two divorced women, one practical and grounded, the other free-spirited and impulsive, move in together to raise their kids as a blended family. It was smart, it was modern, and in the early 1980s it was kind of radical. You didn't often see two women running the household on television without some kind of traditional man in the center, but like many good ideas, it started aging the moment it stopped evolving. Susan St. James and Jane Curtin had real chemistry. Their friendship felt lived in, messy, and real. It was never just about punchlines. It was about resilience. Two women building a life together, not romantically, but in partnership. It spoke to a changing culture, one that was starting to accept different definitions of family. And for a few seasons, that message held strong. But then, the stories started repeating. The same types of conflicts showed up: dating disasters, parenting dilemmas, family tension. But nothing really changed. The characters, so dynamic at first, fell into rigid roles. Kate was always chasing the next adventure. Allie was always playing it safe. And while the contrast was fun early on, it started feeling static, like the characters were stuck playing versions of themselves instead of growing into anything new. The show also struggled to keep its younger characters interesting. The kids grew up, but not in a way that added anything to the story. Their arcs plateaued. They became background noise. And since so much of the emotional center of the show was built around raising children in an unconventional home, that lack of development left a hole. When Kate and Allie first aired, it was saying something bold. By the end, it was saying very little. The tone became more generic. It was not bad. It was just tired. And that might be the quiet tragedy of so many long-running shows from the 1980s. They captured a moment, but when the moment passed, they did not know how to say goodbye. If someone told you in the 1970s that they had a brand new sitcom and it was just like Gilligan's Island, only set in the Old West, you would probably laugh, and then they would tell you Bob Denver was in it, playing basically the same character, just with a cowboy hat instead of a sailor cap. And somehow, by the time the first episode ended, you would realize they were not kidding, and that it sort of worked. Dusty's Trail was unapologetically a copy-paste job. A wagon train gets separated from the rest of the group. Now you have 7 mismatched strangers lost somewhere in the frontier, trying to find their way back to civilization. You had the clueless leader, the snooty rich couple, the pretty school teacher, the shy girl next door, the smart one, and of course, Dusty. Sweet, simple, well-meaning, Dusty. Bob Denver leaned right back into what made him famous. He bumbled. He stumbled. He got the group into more trouble than they needed. But somehow, every time things fell apart, he found a way to help fix them, usually by accident. There was something comforting about it, something familiar, like reruns of your childhood playing out in a different costume. The Old West setting gave the show a different flavor. It was not just about getting off an island, it was about crossing deserts, avoiding bandits, dealing with broken wagon wheels and angry cattle. It played with Western tropes the same way Gilligan's Island played with pirate and jungle ones, and it had that same goofy charm. Wooden dialogue, stock sound effects, and the occasional anachronism thrown in just to keep you on your toes. Critics were not kind. They called it lazy, called it uninspired. But audiences? They found something else. A weird, offbeat comfort. It felt like flipping through the channels and landing on a show you forgot you liked. And before you knew it, you had watched 4 episodes and were halfway through a bowl of popcorn. Dusty's Trail only lasted 1 season, 26 episodes and out. But in those 26 episodes, it carved out a quiet little space in television history. It knew exactly what it was. It was not trying to win awards. It was not trying to break new ground. It just wanted to give you a smile and a soft chuckle at the end of a long day. And sometimes, that is enough. You do not always need irony or edge or a 7-layer story arc. Sometimes, you just need a well-meaning goofball in a cowboy vest, wandering the prairie with his oddball friends doing their best to get home. And if you watched it back then, even once, you remember. You remember the theme song. You remember the way Dusty said, "Oops." And you remember that sometimes the simplest things stick with you the longest. The Charmings was one of those shows that sounded like a setup for a joke. What if Snow White and Prince Charming moved to modern-day Los Angeles? But in 1987, someone said, "Let's roll with it." And the result was a sitcom so bizarre, it felt like a fairy tale collided headfirst with a sitcom from the mall era. And it did not stop there. Snow White, the prince, their 2 kids, the evil queen, and even a talking magic mirror, all crammed into one suburban home like it was totally normal. Because apparently, getting cursed into a centuries-long sleep is not nearly as confusing as trying to work a microwave. That was the whole premise. Fairy tale royalty wakes up in Reagan-era California and tries to live like regular Americans. Prince Charming gets a job. Snow White tries to make friends. Their kids go to school. And the evil queen? She lives in the basement and plots passive-aggressive revenge while doing laundry. This show did not just ask you to suspend disbelief, it drop-kicked it off a castle tower. And that was exactly why it stuck in the minds of every 1980s kid who watched it. Watching fairy tale characters adjust to traffic jams, phone bills, and toaster ovens was oddly satisfying. It was like a bedtime story went rogue and moved into your cul-de-sac. The comedy came from how completely unprepared the Charmings were for the modern world. Snow White had no idea what a credit card was. The prince thought garbage disposals were monsters, and the evil queen, who should have been locked up centuries ago, was instead getting into passive showdowns with neighbors and secretly manipulating household electronics. But the weirdest part? They were actually kind of good at adapting. Like within 3 episodes, they had already figured out how to pay taxes, drive minivans, and buy cheese in plastic wrap. And no one questioned it. Not the school teachers, not the grocery clerks, not even the people next door. Because in sitcom land, anything goes as long as you return the shopping cart. The magic mirror was another level of strange. He lived in the hallway, had the voice of a cranky uncle, and would dish out sarcastic wisdom every time someone walked by. Imagine getting life advice from a wall ornament while brushing your teeth. That was just normal in this house. The show played it all totally straight. No meta jokes, no winks at the camera, just full-on fairy tale chaos with a laugh track. And that is what made the Charmings unforgettable. It was not trying to be a spoof or a parody. It was genuinely trying to show how fairy tale characters would survive in the suburbs. There was heart in the chaos. Snow White genuinely wanted to be a good mom. The prince wanted to provide for his family. And the queen? Well, she just wanted her powers back. And maybe a little respect. Same as any grandma. Even though it only lasted 1 season, the Charmings gave 1980s kids something weirdly comforting. The idea that even if you come from another world, you can still figure out how to use a dishwasher and fall asleep to late-night television. It reminded us that family is family, whether you rule a kingdom or just share a bathroom with a talking mirror and an ex-witch. Mara Wilson did not just play magical girls, she was one. To anyone growing up in the 90s, she was the bright-eyed child who brought life to characters we adored. Whether she was teaching a cruel headmistress a lesson in Matilda or navigating grief in Mrs. Doubtfire, Mara had a presence that was impossible to ignore. She had a warmth that could cut through any screen and land softly in your heart. And then, almost overnight, she was gone. Not fallen, not broken, just elsewhere. As it turns out, Hollywood was not the sanctuary it pretended to be. Mara's decision to leave was not sudden, but it was necessary. The industry that once celebrated her began to suffocate her. By the time she was a teenager, acting felt more like a performance off-screen than on. She was growing up in a space that did not allow her to grow. So she walked away. From the lights, the scripts, the expectations, and toward something truer. Mara became a writer, an advocate, a voice for children who never had one. She opened up about mental health, grief, and what it meant to be a child star when the cameras stopped rolling. And while we lost her as an actress, we gained her as a witness to a world most of us never see. The one behind the curtain, the one without the glitter. Her words became a new kind of performance. Honest, brave, and often heartbreaking. Some child stars fade because the world forgets them. Mara chose to disappear because she remembered herself. And in doing so, she showed us that there is life after the applause ends. A life of purpose, of survival, of healing. That might be the greatest role she has ever played. Rags to Riches was the kind of show that could only exist in a moment where the world still believed a musical number could solve every problem. Airing on NBC from 1987 to 1988, it was basically Annie Meets the Brady Bunch with a splash of grease, all set to the tune of early 60s rock and roll. The plot? A wealthy businessman randomly adopts 6 orphan girls and moves them into his mansion. Cue the family bonding. Cue the chaos. Cue the songs. Each episode followed a dramatic storyline, usually involving friendship, growing pains, or the threat of losing their new home. And every storyline came with at least 2 classic musical performances, except they didn't sing the originals. They rewrote the lyrics to fit the plot. So instead of singing "My Boyfriend's Back," they'd sing "My Sister's Mad," or something that somehow worked in a subplot about report cards. It sounds ridiculous, and maybe it was, but it also hit a sweet spot of television magic that made it perfect Sunday night comfort food. It only ran for 2 seasons, but it made a massive impact on the kids and families who tuned in. You'll find clips online now that feel like time capsules, all teased hair, neon tights, and heart-on-your-sleeve sincerity. Rags to Riches didn't care if you thought it was cheesy. That was the whole point. It was pure optimism, wrapped in a melody, just when people needed it most. Some sitcoms win trophies, somewhere out there welcome. And if one of your favorites made this list, tell us in the comments. Hit like if you ever shouted at the screen, and subscribe so you never miss the shows we secretly loved a little too long.